When one speaks of the Battle of Plataea, the story cannot begin on the plain where the spears crossed, but rather in the decades before, when tension grew between the small world of the Greek city-states and the immense Persian Empire. At the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, the Achaemenid Empire, under the rule of King Darius, had already extended from the plains of Central Asia to the coasts of the Aegean Sea. To the Persians, the Greek cities of Asia Minor were nothing more than rebellious provinces of a vast territory, but for the Greeks, this meant their culture was threatened by a foreign power that did not respect their independence. The Ionian Revolt, which took place between the years 499 and 494 before Christ, lit the spark of this confrontation. The Athenians and the people of Eretria supported the rebels, leading Darius to swear vengeance against all who dared to challenge him. This oath would mark the beginning of the so-called Greco-Persian Wars. In 490 before Christ, the first Persian attempt to subjugate Greece struck with force on the beaches of Marathon. There, a much smaller contingent of Athenian hoplites faced the massive Persian army, and using strategy and discipline managed to defeat the invaders. The victory at Marathon not only saved Athens, but inspired the Greeks to believe that with courage, they could resist a vast and seemingly unstoppable empire. However, the Persian defeat was not the end. On the contrary, it was the beginning of something much greater, for Darius's son, Xerxes, decided that he would return to Greece with an even larger army to crush any resistance. For 10 years, the Persians prepared for the second invasion, amassing resources and soldiers from all regions of the empire. Thus, in 480 before Christ, the new Persian invasion took shape. Xerxes' army crossed the Hellespont and advanced toward the heart of Greece. It was in this context that the heroic episodes of Thermopylae and Salamis unfolded. At Thermopylae, a small contingent led by the Spartan king Leonidas bravely resisted the Persian horde, sacrificing themselves to gain time and slow the enemy's advance. Even with this resistance, Athens was sacked and burned, and it seemed that nothing would be able to stop the Persian advance. However, the Greek navy achieved a crucial victory at Salamis, where the smaller and more agile Hellenic ships managed to outwit the Persian fleet in a narrow strait, causing a devastating defeat for Xerxes. After this naval defeat, Xerxes returned to Asia, leaving behind a large contingent of soldiers under the command of his general Mardonius. And it is at this point in history that the stage for Plataea begins to form. Greece, though devastated, was not defeated. The Persian Empire still had a strong presence in the mainland, and the Greeks knew that a final land battle would be inevitable. Plataea would not be just another battle, but the clash that would define whether Greece would continue to be free or become just another satrapy under Persian rule. The tension of this period cannot be underestimated. Cities were in ruins, people lived in fear, and the Persian army, even weakened by the king's absence, was still powerful and well-equipped. Every Greek citizen was fully aware that the coming battle would not be just about territory, but about the very survival of Hellenic culture. Pride, honor, and freedom were at stake, and this turned the preparation for Plataea into a moment of unity unlike any other in the history of Greece. This is the backdrop, the emotional and historical foundation that sustains the entire importance of the battle that would take place in the year 479 before Christ. With the naval victory at Salamis, the Greeks gained an unexpected breath of hope, but the land still groaned under the scars of destruction. Athens was devastated, its houses burned, its temples reduced to ashes, and its fields trampled by Persian horses. It was as if an open wound had been left in the heart of Hellas. The retreat of Xerxes did not mean safety. It only meant that the enemy had left behind an armed force in Greece, led by an experienced and ruthless man, Mardonius. Mardonius was cunning. He knew that the strength of the Greeks came from their temporary unity, something fragile, almost instinctive, since city-states traditionally lived in conflict with each other. His plan was simple and clever, to offer advantageous agreements to some cities, especially to Athens, in an attempt to break this coalition. At the same time, he fortified his positions in the region of Boeotia, choosing Thebes as his base of operations, since that city was an ally of the Persians. He believed that if he could separate the Athenians from the Spartans, he could defeat them in isolated battles. Meanwhile, the Greek people faced a cruel dilemma. The Persian threat still haunted their lands, crops were scarce, and resources were exhausted. Many men had died at Thermopylae, Salamis, and in countless raids. Every city knew that another defeat could mean the end, yet something stronger than fear began to spread, a feeling that this could be their last chance to defend themselves as a free people. Athens and Sparta, so different in their ways of life and so distrustful of one another, understood that alone they would fall one by one. This understanding would be decisive. It was in this tense and uncertain atmosphere that the Council of the Cities gathered. They knew that Mardonius was building a strong army and that he would attack soon. Greece could not wait for the enemy to come to them. They had to confront him in an organized way, and so began the formation of the great Pan-Hellenic army that would march toward Boeotia for a direct confrontation. And this path would lead them all to a place that would be marked in history, the plain of Plataea. Mardonius remained in Greece with around 300,000 men, a number which, although smaller than Xerxes' original army, still far outnumbered the combined forces of the Greeks. The choice of Thebes as a base was no coincidence. Thebes was a wealthy and strategic city, located in the heart of Boeotia, surrounded by plains that made it easier for Persian cavalry to maneuver. In addition, Thebes was allied with the Persians and offered logistical and political support to Mardonius, further strengthening the Persian position in mainland Greece. With this solid base, Mardonius devised a plan that, by Persian standards, seemed simple and inevitable. He believed that numerical superiority, combined with the experience of his troops and local support, would be enough to crush any resistance. However, he knew that the Greeks had a deadly advantage that had already proved decisive: the ability to fight as a cohesive unit, even when outnumbered. To prevent this from happening again, as it had at Marathon and Salamis, he decided to invest in diplomacy and psychological warfare before risking an open field battle. Mardonius sent messengers to several Greek city-states, bringing tempting promises. He offered gold, land, titles, and immediate peace to all those who agreed to submit to Persian power. In particular, he made a very enticing proposal to Athens, promising to rebuild the destroyed city, restore its glory, and make it a privileged ally within Xerxes' vast empire. The strategy was clear: to break the fragile Greek alliance, ensuring that Athens would either remain neutral or even turn against Sparta. If this happened, Mardonius could face a weakened and divided enemy, defeating them one by one. The reaction of Athens, however, surprised the Persian general. Even in ruins, the Athenians rejected any offer of submission. The memory of recent destruction and the humiliation of a burned city was stronger than any promise of gold or reconstruction. Athens made it clear that they would rather fight to the very end than bow before the enemy. This response inflamed spirits even more and consolidated the union between the cities. When Mardonius realized that diplomacy had failed, he prepared for total war, determined to crush this alliance with brute force. Meanwhile, Sparta was also on the move. The most disciplined army in Greece mobilized for the decisive campaign. Pausanias, nephew of Leonidas, was chosen as supreme commander of the Greek land force. The choice of this commander carried a powerful symbolic weight. It was the continuation of the heroic resistance at Thermopylae. This time, however, the Spartans would march not to defend a narrow pass, but to an open field where the phalanx could show its strength against the Persian infantry. With this, the decision was made. Diplomacy had come to an end. The fate of Greece would be decided in a single battle that was drawing ever closer. In the period leading up to Plataea, Greece experienced a rare moment in its history: the understanding that, despite their profound differences, only together could they resist the overwhelming power of a foreign empire. The idea of unity among the polis, Greek city-states, was almost a contradiction in itself, as these cities were accustomed to fighting among themselves far more often than against external enemies. But in the face of the Persian threat, the instinct for survival spoke louder. After the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, the perception of the war changed. The Greeks understood that, despite isolated victories, the danger was still immense. The presence of Mardonius in Thebes, reinforced by experienced troops, meant that the war had not yet been won. With Athens in ruins and Sparta deeply concerned by the threat, the leaders of the cities decided to convene an assembly to decide what to do. This meeting marked the strengthening of the Hellenic League, a military coalition that united different cities under a single command for common defense. Representatives from Sparta, Athens, Corinth, Plataea, and other smaller cities were present. The atmosphere was tense. Sparta was considered the land's military power, but the Athenians had proven their worth at sea. Corinth feared losing its commercial influence, and Plataea, located near Thebes, knew it would be one of the first targets in case of defeat. The agreement they reached was simple but historic: to put aside their rivalries to form a single army, fight under unified command, and confront the Persians in a decisive battle that would determine the future of Greece. This pact also brought a new sense of duty to each combatant. It was no longer just the defense of a city or a specific territory. It was the defense of a way of life, of a culture, of a language, of an ideal of freedom that united them. And so, little by little, a pan-Hellenic army was assembled. Sparta provided the backbone with its fearsome hoplites. Athens contributed significant contingents and experience in military strategies. Corinth added its troops, and Plataea offered not only soldiers, but also the very field where the battle would be fought. The march of this army toward the north was a spectacle of courage and hope. Each step brought these men closer to the final confrontation. The idea of facing the greatest military power in the world in an open field was terrifying, but at the same time, it fueled pride and determination. For the first time in a long time, the Greek cities were united, and this psychological factor would be just as important as the weapons they carried. Although the union of the Greek cities was an impressive achievement in the face of the Persian threat, it was far from being a simple and harmonious alliance. Each city carried centuries of mistrust, rivalry, and its own pride. Sparta and Athens, in particular, were like opposite poles forced to meet out of necessity. Sparta, with its culture rooted in military discipline, rigid customs, and contempt for luxury, saw the Athenians as fragile and excessively inclined to debate. Athens, on the other hand, proud of its democracy and cultural flourishing, regarded the Spartans as too rigid and resistant to innovation. The war against the Persians, therefore, created a forced coexistence between two radically different ways of life. Within the military councils that preceded Plataea, debates were intense. The Athenians insisted on strategies that took advantage of mobility and tactical intelligence, while the Spartans defended the solid formation of the phalanx and the brute force of heavy infantry. This divergence was not only theoretical. Each city wanted to command the joint army. For the Spartans, it was unthinkable to fight under another city's banner. For the Athenians, who had saved Greece at Salamis, their leadership seemed natural. The decision, however, was that Pausanias, nephew of Leonidas, would take supreme command of the infantry, while the Athenians would play a key role in coordinating maneuvers and the fleet if it became necessary. The tensions also went beyond the question of command. There was a constant fear of desertion. Many believed that at the last moment, some cities could betray the coalition in exchange for Mardonius's promises. This concern was even greater regarding Thebes, which was openly on the Persian side, as well as some smaller cities that had little military strength and might be tempted by an agreement that guaranteed their survival. This atmosphere of distrust weighed on everyone and increased the pressure on strategic decisions. Despite these rivalries and fears, the understanding that this battle would be the last barrier against foreign domination kept the alliance firm. Many soldiers marched not only to defend their territory, but also to show that their city was worthy of respect. This shared sense of honor created a form of collective pride that, even amidst disagreements, became an invisible force that united the pan-Hellenic army. Each man knew that if they retreated or became divided, there would be no second chance. Greece would cease to exist as a free land. This mix of rivalry and the need for cooperation gave the Battle of Plataea a very particular character. It would not be just a clash between two armies. It would be a trial by fire to determine whether the Greeks could act as one people, even if only for a brief moment in their history. With the agreement in place, the Greek cities began to gather the best they had to face the Persians. Sparta brought its hoplites, elite soldiers trained from childhood for war, equipped with bronze armor, large circular shields called hoplons, long spears, and short swords. Alongside them marched equally disciplined allies, forming ranks that looked like human walls. The Spartan phalanx formation was feared throughout Greece, a wall of shields, spears pointing forward, each man covering the flank of the other, moving as if they were one single body. Athens, although more renowned for its navy, was not far behind in its land preparations. Its soldiers were brave and driven by revenge for the destruction of their city. They brought a large number of well-equipped hoplites, ready to fight side by side with the Spartans. Corinth, Plataea, and other cities sent additional reinforcements, adding thousands of men to a pan-Hellenic army that, although smaller in number than the Persians, was very well organized. The Persians, on the other hand, had a diverse army. Their forces gathered peoples from across the empire: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians, and many others. Each group brought its own weapons and ways of fighting. There were skilled archers, experienced cavalrymen, and a massive infantry. The traditional Persian strategy was to weaken the enemy with volleys of arrows and then use the mobility of their cavalry to surround and break the opposing lines. However, in previous battles, this method had proven less effective against the compact formation of the hoplites. Aware of this, the Greeks prepared to avoid any gaps in their lines. They knew that, in close combat, the advantage was theirs. The key would be to withstand the rain of arrows and prevent the Persian cavalry from having room to maneuver. For this, they chose terrain that favored defense: the plain of Plataea. The uneven ground with nearby hills, streams, and areas less suitable for horses would reduce the Persian advantage in mobility. As they marched, each Greek soldier carried not only his spear and shield, but also the heavy responsibility of fighting for the freedom of all of Hellas. Training was daily. The generals reinforced discipline, and the strategists planned how to confront an enemy that, even weakened, still had overwhelming strength. The battle to come would not be decided with a single move. It would be a test of endurance, courage, and organization. Choosing Plataea as the stage for the final battle was neither a coincidence nor a whim. The region of Plataea, located in Boeotia, had a geography that favored the Greeks much more than the Persians. The plain, which at first glance seemed open, was crossed by small streams and surrounded by undulating terrain, which greatly reduced the effectiveness of the Persian cavalry, considered one of Mardonius's greatest advantages. At the same time, these conditions allowed the Greeks to organize a solid defensive line, using the natural protection of the terrain to build an impenetrable resistance. There were nearby hills that could serve as an organized route of retreat if necessary, and the proximity to water sources was a strategically important factor. For the Greeks, the choice of Plataea also carried symbolic and practical meaning. Plataea had remained loyal to the cause of Hellenic freedom since the first Persian invasion and was already seen as a bastion of resistance. The city, relatively small but strategically located, agreed to be the meeting point and the line of defense for the Greek forces. There they would feel they were on friendly ground, with the support of the local population, whereas for the Persians, it was hostile territory. Another important detail was that the position of the armies was relatively close to Thebes, a city that openly supported the Persians. For Mardonius, this meant logistical support and easier supplies. For the Greeks, it meant a constant reminder that they were fighting practically in the backyard of an internal enemy. This proximity increased psychological pressure and made every soldier feel even more obligated to prove their worth under the watchful eyes of both friends and traitors. The arrival of the Greek army in the region was a striking event. Men from different parts of Hellas positioned themselves in long lines, each city occupying a specific sector. The Spartans, as usual, stood in the center of the formation, where the impact of the fighting would be most intense. The Athenians took one flank, and the contingents from other cities filled out the line. Altogether, there were about 40,000 hoplites and tens of thousands of auxiliaries. Even counting their allies, the Greeks were still at a numerical disadvantage compared to the Persian forces, but they were fully aware that their choice of terrain was their greatest advantage. The Persian army, upon arriving at Plataea, positioned itself on the opposite side of the plain. They knew that the longer time passed, the harder it would be to maintain the morale of their foreign troops, who did not share the same motivation as the Hellenes to fight in Greek lands. Mardonius, confident in his numerical superiority, believed he could provoke the Greeks into attacking first. Thus, for many days, both armies simply watched each other, with no one daring to make the first move. It was a duel of patience and strategy before the first spear was thrown. In the first days at Plataea, the tension grew like a taut rope on the verge of breaking. Both armies knew that any wrong step could mean defeat. No commander was willing to risk a rash assault. The result was a prolonged stalemate, during which Greeks and Persians carefully studied one another, while the summer heat scorched the plain and the scarcity of water began to become a problem for everyone. Mardonius, confident in his numerical advantage, tried to lure the Greeks into a frontal attack in open ground where his cavalry could be decisive. To achieve this, he constantly sent small units to harass the Hellenes, shooting arrows, simulating advances, and making quick retreats. But Pausanias, well aware of this ploy, kept his army disciplined and motionless, waiting for the right moment to act. He knew that the strength of the Greeks lay in their compact defense, not in a reckless rush toward death. The Greeks, on the other hand, suffered under the psychological pressure of this weight. Hunger and thirst began to erode the troops' morale. The nearest water sources were under the watchful eye of the Persian cavalry, which constantly launched quick attacks to cut off supplies. This situation forced the Greek council to make a risky decision, to reorganize their positions during the night in order to reach safer water sources before the shortage further weakened their forces. Meanwhile, in the Persian camp, confidence also began to wane. Many foreign soldiers were far from their homelands and could not understand why the fighting did not begin at once. Some of the peoples allied with the Persians fought more out of obligation than loyalty, and the prolonged wait only increased the sense of fatigue and uncertainty. This phase of the battle was marked by an invisible war made of nerves, patience, and psychological endurance. With each day without combat, the tension grew, as if the battlefield itself was preparing for an inevitable explosion. As the days turned into weeks on the plain of Plataea, the war ceased to be merely a matter of spears and shields, and became a battle of physical endurance and supplies. Both Greeks and Persians began to feel the weight of logistics in a field where every resource became vital. It was as if the very earth conspired against both armies, testing their patience before the final confrontation. The summer heat made everything more exhausting. Water, an essential element to keep the troops alive, was scarce, and the closest springs were under constant threat from attacks by the Persian cavalry. Mardonius knew that cutting off water and food supplies was a powerful weapon, and he used his horsemen like fast-moving snakes, advancing and retreating to keep the Greeks from replenishing their resources. On several occasions, small Greek groups sent to gather supplies were surrounded and killed. This began to undermine the physical stamina of the Hellenic troops and threatened the cohesion of the army. For the Persians, however, the situation was not much better. Although they had established themselves in a region near Thebes where they could receive help, maintaining such a large contingent was a daily challenge. The colossal size of the Persian army required an almost unimaginable amount of food and water. Even with supply lines, each day without a decisive battle made resources scarcer and increased the risk of desertion among allied troops who did not share the same motivation as the Greeks. Persian discipline, based more on the authority of the commander than on a collective bond of honor, began to show signs of wear. Inside the Greek camp, hunger was a constant visitor. Rations were distributed with strict control. The smell of sweat, leather, and metal mixed with the fatigue that hung in the air. Every soldier knew that he could not fight at full strength if the situation continued as it was. On the Persian side, although there had been more resources at the beginning, the diversity of peoples under Mardonius's command made organization difficult and created internal tensions. Some soldiers from very distant lands began to wonder why they were risking their lives in a land that was not theirs. This scenario created an unbearable atmosphere in which any spark could turn into a blaze. The Battle of Plataea did not begin with the sound of trumpets, but with a slow erosion, an invisible corrosion of mental and physical resistance on both sides. Each night, as they looked at the enemy's campfires across the plain, both Greeks and Persians knew they were growing weaker and that the final fight was approaching like an inevitable storm. At a certain point, the situation became unsustainable. The shortage of water and food was putting the survival of the Greek troops at risk, and remaining in the same position was like waiting for death. Pausanias and the Hellenic commanders decided it was time to move, but they knew that any movement in broad daylight would be an invitation to massacre by the Persian cavalry. Therefore, a risky maneuver was planned. During the night, the army would silently reposition itself to reach an area closer to the water sources and more favorable for defense. In the darkness, the phalanxes began to move quietly, guided by the starlight. It was a slow and tense movement, for any noise could reveal the maneuver to the Persians. The intention was not to abandon the battlefield, but to reorganize the lines into a better position. However, as with all night operations, confusion arose. Some units separated from the main group, others advanced farther than they should. At dawn, part of the Greek army was in position, but another part was still moving, creating a dangerous impression of disorder and weakness. Mardonius, upon perceiving the movement, interpreted it as a retreat, a desperate flight. Convinced that the Greeks were collapsing, he decided that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Without hesitation, he ordered an immediate attack, confident that he would catch the enemy in flight and crush them before they could reorganize. Dawn on the plain of Plataea became a moment of chaos. Persian drums began to echo, and a wave of soldiers charged against the Greek positions. Archers fired arrows in a dense arc, while the cavalry advanced to break the lines. For the Greeks, who were still in motion, it was a brutal shock. The battle began, not in a prepared scenario, but in the midst of chaos, forcing each soldier to find his position and fight for his life. This initial Persian assault turned the morning into a desperate scene. Many Greeks were caught by surprise, but the discipline inherited from years of training made it possible for the lines to gradually reorganize. What had seemed like a retreat turned in a matter of minutes into a wall of shields that began to absorb the impact of the Persian assault. The Battle of Plataea had begun explosively and unexpectedly, and from that moment on, every meter of the battlefield would become a stage of resistance and heroism. The morning that broke over the plain of Plataea was heavy with tension and dust, raised by the hooves of the Persian horses. Mardonius's sudden charge, driven by his mistaken belief that the Greeks were fleeing, hurled the massive Persian army like a wave crashing violently against a rock. The first moments were chaotic. The Greek lines were still forming, some units were scattered, and there were dangerous gaps in their formation. Yet this apparent chaos, which Mardonius believed to be an opportunity, would become a trap that would test the true essence of the Hellenic phalanx. The Persians attacked in mass, their archers unleashing a storm of arrows that darkened the sky, while their cavalry pressed forward to break the flanks. In the center, the Persian infantry advanced at a fast pace, their war cries echoing across the plain. However, the uneven ground and small natural obstacles began to hinder the mobility of the mounted troops. The scattered formation, initially fragile, began to come together rapidly, guided by the almost instinctive discipline of the hoplites. Every man knew that the only path to survival was to close ranks, join shield to shield, and advance as a single living wall. The Spartan line, even attacked by surprise, showed remarkable firmness. With Pausanias at the front, the hoplites held their ground, enduring the rain of arrows and the first hand-to-hand clashes. Each Persian advance was met by spears thrust forward like the teeth of a wild beast. Seeing the central line reform, the Athenians on the right flank hurried to close the formation and prevent an encirclement. This reinforcement allowed the Greeks to hold on and prevented the numerical advantage of the Persians from turning into an immediate collapse. On the Persian side, initial confidence turned into impatience. The expectation of finding a fleeing enemy did not materialize. What had seemed a disorganized army began to steady itself with each passing moment, and the quick attacks that were supposed to be decisive now crashed against a wall of bronze. The sound of shields clashing, the impact of spears striking armor, and the collective roar of the hoplites turned the battlefield into an inferno of noise and dust. It was at this moment that the battle assumed its true form. The fight was no longer an opportunistic assault. It became a direct confrontation, hand to hand, where every inch of ground was won at the cost of blood. Mardonius, realizing that he would not be able to break through the lines immediately, began directing more and more troops to the spots where the Greek formation seemed weakest, hoping that constant pressure could finally shatter their cohesion. But what he did not know was that this kind of combat was exactly where the Greeks were strongest. Pausanias's patience in waiting for the right moment had borne fruit. Now, instead of a disordered retreat, the Pan-Hellenic army was solidified, ready to absorb the impact and strike back at the right time. The combat at Plataea became a test of endurance. The initial Persian pressure was devastating, but it failed to break the Hellenic lines. On the contrary, with every minute that passed, the hoplites' resistance became more solid. The Spartans, led by Pausanias, stood as an impenetrable wall, their spears forming a barrier of iron and their shields leaning against each other like bricks in a fortress. The Persian archers, realizing the ineffectiveness of their arrows against the compact ranks, intensified their volleys, but the combination of heavy armor and shields reduced the damage. The cavalry, which was the Persians' greatest advantage, struggled with the terrain and was unable to perform wide maneuvers to outflank the phalanxes. This slowly began to erode Persian confidence. Meanwhile, the Greeks advanced slowly, pushing the enemy back inch by inch. Every step forward was earned amid the deafening sound of metal clashing and the cries of the wounded. The effort was superhuman. The hoplites fought not only with their bodies but with the conviction that if they fell, all of Greece would fall with them. This sense of collective responsibility was the flame that fed their resistance until an opportunity arose, and it came. Amid the chaos, a part of the Persian army attempted a more aggressive attack at the center, but overextended itself, creating a gap in their own lines. Pausanias, alert, noticed the mistake. With a firm command, he ordered a concentrated advance at that point. The Spartan phalanx pushed with force, launching itself against the Persians who had advanced too far. This maneuver transformed defense into attack and destabilized the entire Persian line. The impact of this counterattack was devastating. The Persians, caught off balance, retreated in disorder. The psychological effect was immediate. For the first time, the Persian forces showed clear signs of weakness. This turning point reignited the Greeks' confidence, and they advanced even more, their war cries echoing across the plain. The sound of spears pounding against shields mixed with a roar that seemed to come from centuries of resistance. The Battle of Plataea was no longer just a fight for survival. It was starting to become a possible victory. But the fight was far from over. The next moment would be even more decisive, as in the midst of the chaos, an event would forever change the destiny of that morning. The gradual advance of the Greeks turned the plain of Plataea into a scene of fierce resistance, but it was the death of Mardonius that triggered the decisive turning point of the battle. For hours the two armies clashed, with the Persians trying to break the Hellenic formation and the Greeks responding with discipline and strength. Pausanias remained calm even as the Spartan lines were pushed to their limit. Then, in one of those direct clashes at the center of the battle, a precise strike found the Persian commander. Ancient sources describe that Mardonius fought mounted, personally defending his line, encouraging his men to keep up the attack. With the Persian formation overextended in an effort to break through the Spartan line, a group of hoplites managed to get close enough. In a moment of distraction, a thrown spear struck Mardonius's horse, knocking him to the ground. In the chaos, he was surrounded and killed amid the dust and noise of battle. His death, though quick, had a devastating effect on the morale of the Persian troops. With Mardonius fallen, the Persian chain of command collapsed. Up to that moment, even amid exhaustion, the soldiers had fought under clear orders and under the presence of a leader who kept them organized. Once they realized their commander was dead, their confidence evaporated. Confusion spread quickly, units began to retreat in different directions, and the pressure that had seemed unbearable for the Greeks turned into an open path for a counterattack. The sight of the general's death had the opposite effect on the Greeks. The morale of the hoplites rose as if a flame had been reignited. They knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the opportunity to push back the weakened enemy. Pausanias gave the order for a massive advance. The Spartan phalanx moved forward like a wall, closing every gap, while the Athenians and the allied contingents pressed from the flanks. For the Persians, the situation became a nightmare. Without unified command, each foreign contingent began to fight on its own, trying to reorganize or flee. The discipline of the Greek troops contrasted violently with the Persian chaos. The plain, which moments earlier had been a balanced battlefield, now turned into a desperate rout on multiple fronts. This moment marks the transition of the battle into a slaughter. The death of Mardonius not only removed Persian strategic leadership, but also shattered their morale and opened the path for Hellenic victory. Yet the battle still had one final bloody chapter before silence returned to Plataea. After Mardonius's death, what little organization remained in the Persian army quickly dissolved. The forces that still tried to resist were driven back, and soon their priority shifted from attacking to surviving. Mass flight began. Men from many nations who had been fighting under the Persian banner ran to the camp in an attempt to protect themselves or find an escape route. The Greeks, seeing the enemy in disarray, did not waste the opportunity. Instead of simply holding them off, they advanced like a wave. Step by step, the phalanxes broke their resistance and pushed the enemy back into their own fortified camp. The pressure was so intense that the Persians had no time to reorganize their internal defenses. In a short time, the Hellenic lines reached the palisades surrounding the Persian camp. The assault on the camp was brutal. The Greeks, driven by years of accumulated fury from the war, stormed the improvised defenses. Fighting took place from tent to tent. In the middle of absolute chaos, Persians who tried to resist were killed, and those who could not escape were captured or cut down. It was as if all the violence and pain caused by the Persian invasions were being repaid in that moment. Some Persian contingents, especially those from more distant lands and less committed to the cause, took advantage of the confusion to escape across open fields, but most were not so fortunate. What had been considered one of the greatest land forces of the ancient world was reduced to a scattered, defeated army in full retreat. The losses were enormous, and the number of dead far exceeded any initial expectations. When the sun finally set, the plain of Plataea was covered with bodies. Silence once again dominated the battlefield, broken only by the isolated cries of those still seeking help among the wounded. For the Greeks, it was a total victory. For the Persians, it was the definitive end of their ambition to conquer Greece by land. Plataea had become a grave for imperial arrogance. This victory consolidated what Thermopylae, Salamis, and Marathon had only announced: that Greece, even when divided, was capable of resisting any empire when it fought united. But the effects of this battle would not end there. The immediate consequences would shape the coming years of Hellenic history. The victory at Plataea did not belong to a single hero, nor to a single city, but to the combined effort of an entire people who, in a rare moment of their history, set aside their rivalries to face a common enemy. Every city-state involved brought something unique to the battlefield, and in the end the triumph was a mosaic composed of these different contributions, all of them indispensable. Sparta, without a doubt, was the central pillar of resistance. The Spartans brought the discipline and courage that had become legendary. Under the leadership of Pausanias, they formed the most solid core of the defensive line, withstanding the heaviest impact of the Persian advance and holding the fight until the opportunity for the counterattack appeared. The flawless formation of the Spartan phalanx was the wall that prevented collapse at the very moment when everything seemed lost. It was thanks to the calm and firmness of the Spartans that the Greek center did not break and was able to advance once Mardonius fell. Athens, for its part, played a crucial role on the flank, ensuring that the Greek formation would not be encircled. Although the Athenian navy was not decisive at Plataea, the Athenian hoplites displayed uncommon valor on land. Many accounts mention the vigor and energy with which the Athenians resisted the constant attacks, and the way they helped reorganize the lines during the first moments of chaos. The Athenian courage on that day was driven by the desire for revenge for the destruction of their city and by the pride of proving that Athens was still alive. Corinth also had a significant participation. Its troops reinforced the formation and provided essential logistical support. Plataea, the host city of the battle, offered not only its men but also its own territory as a sacrifice in the name of freedom. The name of this small city would enter history as the symbol of a struggle that went far beyond its geographical limits. Other smaller cities such as Megara, Thespiae, and Aegina contributed smaller but no less important contingents. Every single man counted in that army represented a collective effort. This combination of forces ensured that the Hellenic line was strong enough to withstand the initial impact and maintain cohesion at the most critical moment. The most remarkable achievement was that all these cities, accustomed to seeing each other as rivals, fought as if they were one single body. The rivalry that had once fueled internal wars was transformed that day into an energy directed toward a greater purpose: the defense of Hellenic freedom and culture. This victory not only saved Greece from Persian conquest, but also left as a legacy the certainty that when united, the Greeks were practically unbeatable. The end of the Battle of Plataea meant far more than the death of a general or the destruction of an enemy army. It was the final act of the Second Persian invasion and a definitive milestone in Greek history. As soon as the last sounds of combat ceased, the battlefield became a silent testimony to the courage and sacrifice that had shaped the destiny of the Hellenes. With the victory, the Persian threat over mainland Greece was eliminated. Without Mardonius's leadership, and with their troops decimated, the Persian Empire lost its ability to maintain any position on Greek soil. The survivors fled in disarray beyond the Hellespont, and the Persian presence, once so dominant, quickly disappeared. The war, which for years had brought fear and destruction to the Greek cities, was finally coming to an end. From a political point of view, this victory consolidated Sparta's position as the leading military power on land and strengthened Athens's prestige as the leading naval force. The tensions between the two cities, though silenced during the war, would reappear later, but at that moment, both shared the glory. The confidence won at Plataea rekindled Greek pride and fueled a renewed spirit of independence. Culturally, Plataea had a profound impact. For the first time, the idea of a collective Hellenic identity gained strength. Until then, the cities saw themselves as autonomous units, but after facing the greatest empire in the world and emerging victorious, the Greeks began to see themselves as part of something larger. This perception would influence the entire cultural and political development of the following decades. Furthermore, Plataea had direct military consequences. With the enemy weakened, the Greeks were able to plan offensives beyond the mainland, beginning campaigns to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor that were still under Persian control. The victory, therefore, not only ended the immediate threat, but also opened the way for a more offensive stance, which would lead the Greeks to take control of the war. The dead were honored, and the battlefield became a sacred place. For years, ceremonies were held in memory of those who had fought there, reminding future generations that freedom was bought at a very high price. Plataea ceased to be just a city and became an immortal symbol of Hellenic resistance. With the near-total destruction of the Persian army at Plataea and the death of Mardonius, the balance of power shifted completely. What until then had been a defensive war, marked by resistance on Greek soil, now began to transform into an offensive war. The Hellenes, now confident in their strength, decided that the best way to guarantee the freedom of their cities would be to take the fight directly to the lands where the Persian Empire still maintained control. Thus began the boldest phase of the Greco-Persian Wars, the campaign to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Right after the victory at Plataea, the Greek forces gathered to organize their next actions. Athens, whose fleet had been the protagonist at Salamis, naturally took the lead at sea. The Athenians understood that with the Persians weakened on land, their navy became the primary target to completely neutralize Persian influence. This decision led to a series of naval operations across the Aegean Sea, where the Greeks hunted down and destroyed Persian naval bases and cut their supply routes. One of the first major victories of this new phase occurred at the Battle of Mycale, also in the year 479 before Christ. While the land forces triumphed at Plataea, the Greek fleet confronted and defeated the Persian navy near Mount Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. This victory practically ended the Persian naval presence in the region and opened the way for the liberation of the Greek cities located there. It was as if Plataea had an immediate echo at sea, creating a double blow that destroyed Persian military power in the Aegean once and for all. With naval advances and the fall of Persian bases, several Ionian cities revolted and freed themselves from foreign rule. This wave of rebellions was directly supported by the mainland Greeks, who began to occupy positions once held by the enemy. The Hellenic League, which had been born out of the need for defense, now began to transform into an offensive alliance with reach beyond Greek territory. The psychological impact of these consecutive victories cannot be overstated. For the first time in years, the Greeks no longer fought with the feeling of being on the brink of annihilation, and instead fought with the confidence that they could dictate the course of the conflict. This period marks the beginning of an era in which Athens, with its powerful navy, would begin to expand its influence, planting the seeds of what would later become the Athenian Empire. The offensive in Asia Minor not only secured the liberation of the Greek cities, but also redefined the relationship between the Hellenes and the Persians. After Plataea and Mycale, the fear that had once dominated the Greeks was replaced by a feeling of superiority. The war did not officially end at that moment, but the Persians would never again pose as direct a threat to Greece as they had in the years leading up to these confrontations. The consequences of the victory at Plataea were profound, not only from a military and political perspective, but also in the collective imagination of the Greek people. The triumph over the greatest empire of the time became an eternal symbol of resistance and of how an apparently fragmented society could, when united, overcome any adversity. Plataea marked a turning point in the Hellenic mindset, shaping the self-perception of Greece for generations to come. Until that moment, the city-states saw themselves above all as rivals. The identity of an Athenian, a Spartan, or a Corinthian was more important than the idea of simply being Greek. The victory at Plataea, however, showed that when these peoples united under a single purpose, they were capable of facing even the greatest empire in the world. This realization created the clearest concept of a pan-Hellenic spirit, which would go on to influence culture, politics, and the arts. This collective pride was also reflected in architecture and religion. In Athens, for example, years later, the reconstruction of the city, destroyed by the Persians, was carried out with a care that transformed the Acropolis into one of the greatest symbols of victory and cultural rebirth. Temples, statues, and festivals began to celebrate not only the gods, but also the human courage demonstrated in the Greco-Persian Wars. The Olympic Games, which already existed, took on an even greater dimension, becoming not only sporting competitions, but also events that reinforced unity and the memory of this period. From a psychological perspective, the victory at Plataea erased the feeling of inferiority that many Greeks had in the face of the grandeur of the Persian Empire. The fear that had dominated the first years of the war was replaced by an almost unshakable confidence. This confidence, however, also brought future consequences. The rise of Athens and its growing influence would, decades later, lead to a new conflict, the Peloponnesian War, against Sparta. But at that moment, just after Plataea, the dominant feeling was one of victory, pride, and freedom. In the artistic field, poets, playwrights, and historians found inexhaustible inspiration in the battles against the Persians. Herodotus, considered the father of history, would dedicate a significant part of his work to narrating these events, ensuring that the memory of the Hellenic victory would be preserved forever. Plataea was not just a battle, it was an affirmation of identity that would shape the entire history of classical Greece. With the end of the Persian threat on Greek soil after the victories at Plataea and Mycale, Greece entered a new phase of its history. However, victory brought not only glory but also new challenges. The city-states, which had united under the pressure of a foreign invasion, slowly returned to their old rivalries, and the balance of power began to reconfigure itself. The war, which had been the catalyst for unity, left behind a much more complex and dynamic political landscape. Athens was, without a doubt, the city most transformed by this period. After seeing their polis reduced to ashes by the Persians, the Athenians returned to a place in ruins, but with a renewed spirit. They rebuilt their city with grandeur, and the following years marked the beginning of the so-called Golden Age of Athens. The fleet, which had been decisive in the naval battles, became a symbol of the city's power, ensuring safe routes in the Aegean and projecting Athenian influence over other Greek cities. This naval superiority and the creation of the Delian League, a military alliance initially intended to keep the Persians away, placed Athens at the center of attention. Sparta, on the other hand, remained the uncontested land-based military power. Its leadership at Plataea solidified its reputation as the most disciplined army in Greece. However, unlike Athens, Sparta chose not to involve itself in maritime or commercial policies. This detachment meant that little by little, the two cities began to follow different paths, reigniting the tensions that had been dormant during the Greco-Persian Wars. Other Greek cities, such as Corinth, Plataea, Megara, and Aegina, also reaped benefits from the victory. Some prospered thanks to the increase in safe trade after the Persian weakening, while others used the prestige gained on the battlefield to consolidate their local influence. However, with the rise of Athens, the sense of balance began to disappear, and the rivalry for hegemony between Athens and Sparta became increasingly evident. In cultural terms, the post-Greco-Persian Wars period witnessed an unprecedented artistic and intellectual flourishing. The pride of having defeated the greatest empire of the time inspired sculptors, architects, poets, and philosophers. What had once been paralyzing fear gave way to a creative confidence that would shape all of Western civilization. It was in this environment that great figures such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and later Pericles emerged, transforming Athens into a center of culture and power. Politically, Greece would never be the same. The alliance that had been created to face a common enemy began to fragment as the cities resumed their own interests. This fragmentation over time would open the way for new internal conflicts, culminating in the Peloponnesian War a few decades later. But at that moment, in the immediate period after Plataea, there was still a sense of shared accomplishment, a vivid reminder that when united the Greeks were capable of extraordinary feats. The legacy of Plataea went beyond the military sphere. The battle consolidated the notion that the ancient world had witnessed something extraordinary, the victory of small independent states over the greatest imperial power of their time. This achievement, in addition to changing the course of the war, redefined the way the Greeks saw themselves and how they would be seen by other civilizations in the centuries to come. From a military point of view, Plataea became a classic example of discipline and strategy overcoming brute force. It became clear that even outnumbered, a well-coordinated force with favorable terrain and strong motivation could defeat an overwhelming enemy. This lesson would be studied and admired by later generations, shaping concepts of war even in the modern era. Politically, the victory marked the beginning of a period in which Greek cities took on a greater role in the Mediterranean. The Persians, who once seemed invincible, were forced to content themselves with their borders in Asia and rethink their influence in the Aegean Sea. For the Greeks, this meant not only freedom, but also the opportunity to expand their own sphere of influence. Culturally, Plataea left an indelible mark. Art, literature, and philosophy flourished, inspired by the newly acquired confidence. Plataea came to symbolize not just victory in battle, but the triumph of the free spirit over tyranny. Many festivals and ceremonies began to be held annually to remember the sacrifice of the dead on that battlefield. The city of Plataea became a sacred place, a point of memory for all of Hellas. Perhaps the greatest legacy, however, was the strengthening of the idea of freedom. The notion that a small, fragmented, and constantly disputing people could unite at a decisive moment and defeat a formidable empire became a powerful narrative that would echo for centuries. Plataea, alongside Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, entered history not only as a military victory, but as a landmark of human resistance against oppression. Behind the grand historical spectacle that was the Battle of Plataea lie lesser-known stories, small details which, though often forgotten, help to reveal the deeply human dimension of that clash. One of the most fascinating points is the way in which the Greeks, even in the midst of tension and fear, managed to maintain religious practices and rituals before and during the fighting. Pausanias, the Spartan commander, was known for his devotion to the gods and for never initiating any decisive military movement without first consulting the omens. During the most tense moments of the battle, it is said that he waited for favorable signs before ordering the advance, even while under a rain of arrows. These details show how war in ancient Greece was deeply interwoven with the belief in divine intervention. Another curious aspect concerns the actual number of soldiers. Ancient sources such as Herodotus mention immense figures, speaking of hundreds of thousands of Persians, but modern studies indicate that these figures were probably exaggerated to emphasize the grandeur of the Greek victory. Even so, even with smaller numbers, it is agreed that the Persians outnumbered the Greeks, which makes the Hellenic victory all the more remarkable. This discrepancy in figures is a clear example of how history is also built upon heroic narratives. There are also individual stories that arose from this confrontation. It is said that many Greek fighters who survived were honored not only for their bravery, but for specific acts of courage. Soldiers from small cities who, on their own, might have had little impact on the outcome of the war, played crucial roles at key moments, preventing Persian advances or protecting wounded leaders. The collective memory, however, absorbed these smaller stories into a larger narrative, but archaeological records contain references to offerings made by families to celebrate the courage of their relatives who fought at Plataea. Another curious detail is the way the battlefield was preserved. After the victory, the Greeks made sure to maintain part of the plain as a memorial where nothing was built or planted, as a gesture of respect for the dead. For many years, Plataea was the site of religious ceremonies and festivals in honor of those who had fallen, especially those who sacrificed themselves to protect the freedom of Greece. This practice turned the region into a lasting symbol of unity and resistance. Finally, something rarely remembered is that after the battle, the Greeks found an immense amount of wealth, weapons, and luxurious objects in the Persian camp, items the Persians had brought in the expectation of an easy victory. These treasures were used to finance the reconstruction of destroyed cities and to build temples and monuments celebrating the newly won freedom. Persian opulence, seen up close, served as a reminder that the war was not merely a dispute over territory, but a clash of cultures and values. After the victory, the city of Plataea became a living symbol of the sacrifice and courage that had secured Greece's freedom. In memory of those who had fallen in battle, an annual festival was established that lasted for generations. Every year, the city-states sent representatives to take part in these ceremonies, a gesture that not only honored the dead, but also reaffirmed the commitment to Hellenic unity. The festival began with silent processions. Priests, citizens, and soldiers walked through the battlefield carrying wreaths and offerings for the tombs of the fallen. There they performed sacrifices to honor the gods, especially Zeus, and poured libations in memory of the warriors who had died. The tombs were kept as sacred places, untouched by time, and served as a reminder that freedom came at a cost, and that this land had been watered with the blood of many. Over the years, this festival also became a kind of cultural celebration. Athletic competitions and poetry contests were held in honor of the victory, uniting sport, art, and religion in a single event. Young people were encouraged to participate as a way of keeping alive the memory and example of courage left by the fighters of Plataea. These ceremonies were not merely commemorative. They also worked as a political and educational tool, reminding new generations that division among the cities could be fatal and that only unity could protect Greece from external threats. For centuries, these celebrations helped to keep the flame of Hellenic identity alive, even as internal rivalries began to grow again. To this day, the Battle of Plataea is remembered not only as the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, but as a milestone in the history of freedom and resistance. That field, where thousands of lives were lost, became an eternal symbol that collective courage is capable of defeating forces that seem invincible. Thus, the memory of Plataea continued to resonate long after the war ended, as a call to courage, unity, and perseverance.